Good morning. I have been rewriting my presentation pretty much every week at this point. I was giving a presentation last week, and Trump announced the Mexico-Canada tariffs while I was on stage, and I was getting questions about it. So, President Trump, if you're listening, if you could hold off for the next hour, that would be really nice for me. I begin every single presentation I do the exact same way. I am here with the unrighteous and profane task of speaking to you today about politics. All of you have political opinions in this room. I also have political opinions. Not only that, I guarantee you that my political opinions are better than your political opinions. If you'd like to hear about how much more righteous and correct I am than you, I will be here for the rest of the day. As a proper Southern gentleman, bourbon is my poison of choice. I think it takes about 3 to enjoy the conversation about political opinions. But that's not why I'm up here. I'm here to give you an objective sense of what I think is going on in the world today. If I do my job correctly, you will have no idea who I voted for in the last presidential election. Some of the things I say will make you want to light your hair on fire. Good. If you agree with every single thing I say in this presentation, I have not done my job correctly. My job is to try and describe what I think is going on in the world and where I think we're going, and hopefully you can plug that into what you're doing on the farm every day and make it productive. So, I have 3 main goals, and I only have 45 minutes to do it. So I'm going to paint with a broad brush, and we're going to move fairly quickly, because I am committed to making sure we have time for question and answer. First of all, I want to model how the world is working. I want to understand what's going on in the international political system. Second, I want to talk about President Trump and his tariffs and try to explain what the heck I think is going on. And then third, I want to take some silver linings for specifically corn and soybean growers in the room. So let's buckle up our seatbelts and get in. Before we can model what is going on in the world today, I want to define how agriculture has worked for the last 100 years. World War I was a really bad time for not just US farmers, but farmers all over the world. And that was because in the context of World War I, we had all these great technological innovations, and one of them was the advent of modern fertilizers. And modern fertilizers were great. They meant that you could increase yields beyond anybody's wildest imagination, but that drove down the price of a bunch of different agricultural commodities. And things got so bad in the years right after World War I that the US government was literally telling farmers to burn their crops in the field, to try and take some of their commodities off the market. Now insert Herbert Hoover. He's Secretary of Agriculture at the time. He later becomes President of the United States, and he decides he's going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He's going to save the US farmer by making sure he can export all of these surplus calories to international markets where they can get a better price and where they can continue to sustain their lives on the farm. And number 2, he sees that Europe is particularly hard up. A lot of their agriculture was destroyed in the war, so he's going to prevent the rise of communism and fascism by making sure the young men and women of Europe are fed at the time. Now, he nailed number 1. Because ever since that moment, US agriculture has been about exporting surplus abroad. He didn't do so well with preventing the rise of communism and fascism. That didn't work out so well. But literally since the 1920s, US ag has been thinking about exporting abroad, to the point where this is what a map looks like today in terms of food self-sufficiency. The darker you are on this map, the more self-sufficient you can be in terms of calories. What I want you to see on this map is there is a lot of light. There is a lot of gray. Those are all countries in the world that cannot produce enough food to feed themselves. Countries that maybe couldn't have culture without agriculture, to reference what we were talking about just a second ago. Between 11 and 28% of the population can feed itself. This is over 4 billion people. And this is globalization in a nutshell. All the countries that are shaded darker here, they export their surplus calories abroad, and the 4 billion people in the countries that are shaded in light import those calories and are able to live and have families and things like that. That, I think, is beginning to change. I think countries are thinking more and more about the self-sufficiency of their food supply chains, and that's because the world is becoming a multipolar geopolitical environment. Now, multipolar is just a fancy, highfalutin, pretentious word to say that there is not one dominant power in the global system today. I don't care how old you are. I don't care how much experience you have. None of us in this room have lived in a multipolar geopolitical era. The last truly multipolar era was the 1890s. If you were alive then, please find me afterwards. I would like to know the secret to longevity and living forever. For the last 30 to 40 years, it has been a unipolar world. We have called the shots. Everybody listened to us no matter what. Everybody wanted to join the WTO. Everybody wanted to be a part of the US trading complex, Iran and North Korea being maybe the outliers. Before that, we had a bipolar world. dominated by the Soviet Union on the one side, the United States on the other. This is a thought experiment of mine. I update it every quarter or so. I'm not going to get everything right here, but when you're thinking about the world, I want you to think of it in terms of different spheres of influence. You can see on this map, I've got the United States in dark blue, I've got China in orange, I've got Europe in that ugly shade of teal. Turkey is in red. That sometimes makes people raise their eyebrows. They're building military bases in every single one of those countries. I cannot decide if India is about to take over the world or completely collapse in on itself, so I just punt and throw it into a group of middle powers. The specifics are not important. It is no longer about make the best product for the cheapest price and somebody will buy it in the global marketplace. Politics is going to dominate this from now on. I have been saying this for over 10 years. Secretary of State Rubio, in an interview just yesterday, used the word multipolar. I haven't heard a US elected official or a US appointed official like that use that word since the Nixon administration. So maybe we're finally getting somewhere in terms of the government realizing that this is what is happening. That can be a little abstract, so let me make it a little more concrete. The last act of the Biden administration on its way out of the White House was to restrict US exports of certain types of semiconductors to different countries in the world. The countries in blue have basically no restrictions, the countries in yellow have some restrictions, and the countries in pink have a lot of restrictions. This is telling you right now that the United States is dividing up the world into those that it wants to have good trade relations with and those that it won't have good trade relations with. For something as meaningless as how countries vote at the United Nations, we are seeing massive differences in how trade is developing. Countries that are voting together at the United Nations over the last 2 years have been trading with each other between 6 and 8% more, whereas countries that have been voting against each other at the United Nations have been trading between 4 and 6% less. And that's a meaningless UN vote thing. Just imagine if we were actually talking about things that were important to countries and not just how they're virtue signaling at the United Nations. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm saying everybody's just going to go home and trade with themselves. That's not what I'm saying at all. This is a great map. It's showing you different trade flows and how they're increasing or decreasing in the world and how that might change out to 2033. What I want you to see is there's actually a lot of green on this map. So even if at the top level, trade between the great Olympian powers like the United States, China is decreasing, all these countries on the periphery like Mexico, Brazil, India, Indonesia, these are all countries that are actually trading more with each other, and that more trade is happening in some of those regional blocks and regional spheres of influence. Trade wars and things like that are best for the countries that are not a part of the trade war, and you're already seeing that happen a little bit in general. Now, let's tie that directly to ag. This map should also look a little bit familiar, but this is showing you what crop yields are like relative to potential in all of the world. The dark red areas or the dark orange areas on this map are places where their yields are not even close to what they could be if they had a modicum of modern seed technology, modern equipment, modern approaches to how agriculture works in general. There's a lot of space out there for these places that have been importing calories from abroad because it was cheaper and easier to increase their own production. A couple examples. A couple years ago, I was giving a presentation and I made fun of Ethiopia because Ethiopia came out and said, we are going to become a wheat exporter in 2 years. And I laughed. I said, that's nonsense. Not only are they not going to be able to do it, they're fighting a civil war amongst themselves. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that civil war. There was no possible way that the Ethiopian government could surge wheat production. It took all of 2 years for them to make me look like an idiot. Because now, not only are they self-sufficient for wheat for themselves, they export to the rest of East Africa. And they're talking about the next staple crops that they want to do it for, not just for their own country, but for exporting in the region. So you look around the world, it's not just about China, it's not just about the United States. All these different countries are seeing what's happening in the world, and they're saying, we want to be a little more self-sufficient. We want to understand how to do things a little bit differently. You might be asking yourself, by the way, how do the Ethiopians pull this off? It was very simple. The Ethiopian government went out and bought seeds and bought tractors and went to the farms and said, use these and use these at this time, and your yields will increase 40 to 50%. That's exactly what happened. To bring that a little closer to home, we have lost our status or are in the process of losing our status as the low-cost producer for corn and soybeans. Brazil is going to be the country that ascends to that title going forward. Now, corn, it's a little bit back and forth. We've been playing back and forth with them, but soybeans, this trend is already a little bit long in the tooth. Now, that doesn't mean the end for corn and soybeans, but it means that something fundamental is also changing in your markets as all of these things are changing on the top. And I'll get to what that means sort of by the end. But as you have Brazil as an alternative supplier, that means if a country like China doesn't want to buy US soybeans anymore, they don't have to. There are alternative markets, and Brazil looks like it's going to be growing from here on in. Which is to say, and I did a radio interview just before I came on here, if you're looking for the best potential export market in the future for the United States, let it be the United States. Food insecurity in this country, and the most agriculturally blessed country in the entire world, averages at 10.4%. In some parts of the country, it's even higher than that. I live in Louisiana right now. Somehow we have food insecurity that is above the 10.4% average, and yet we also have an over 50% obesity rate. I'm not quite sure how we accomplish that, but we do amazing things. In general, though, one of the things that I learned from inflation was that, yes, people will complain, and people will say, I want lower prices, but they will pay the prices. They will pay to put food on the table. They will pay to get the eggs from his wife. They will pay if the things in the store cost a little bit more. And so I think first and foremost, we need to be thinking about our domestic market first. We've got a few signs that this is already beginning to happen. There's a lot of things to talk about with the recent, is it the dissolution of USAID? Is it the temporary pause of USAID? I don't know. But USAID buys almost $1 billion worth of US agricultural commodities to send them to different markets all around the world. We've been told for most of our lives that it's our responsibility to feed the world. Well, maybe it's our responsibility to feed ourselves first. Which brings me to the second part of the presentation. How do we understand what is going on in the White House and with President Trump and his foreign policy? I made a mistake here a couple of months ago, or 6 to 8 months ago. When I was on the road talking about the election, I was putting President Trump in conversation with figures like George Washington. I was thinking that he was going to be an isolationist, that America first meant he was going to turn inward, and that there was a good and robust American foreign policy tradition around that isolationism. It took all of 2 weeks after he won the election for me to realize that that was wrong, and that really he was invoking a different American foreign policy tradition, which is that of imperialism. The picture here, does anybody know which president? Raise your hand if you know who the president is that picture is of on the screen right now. Just a few. That is former President William McKinley. He was president from 1898 to 1900. You probably know his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, a lot better because he took over when McKinley was assassinated. President Trump cannot stop talking about this man. And the reason he can't stop talking about this man is because there's a lot of eerie similarities. He was a protectionist president who loved to raise tariffs on a bunch of different markets around the world. He oversaw the United States when it won the Spanish-American War, so when we took the Philippines and Puerto Rico and a bunch of different former Spanish colonies and tried to put them under US power. He also thought a lot about fiscal conservatism. He was the opposite of William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech. We don't have to go through high school history again. But that's who McKinley is, and that's who President Trump admires. And this was a time when US foreign policy was absolutely imperial. Some people say that the things that President Trump are saying are outside of the bounds, that they're crazy. They wouldn't have been crazy in the early 1900s. That magazine article there from Puck that I have on the chart, it shows a bald eagle spreading its wings from Asia all the way to Panama, which was an obsession in the early 1900s for the United States even then. So we are returning in some sense to that imperialist foreign policy. The problem for us and for President Trump is he is trying to pull this off in a world that is multipolar. In a world where our relative share of political dominance and economic influence has begun to decline. I want to briefly illustrate that by that crazy US-Colombia trade spat that came out of nowhere just a week ago. Colombia's top export to the United States is oil. And that is a bad export to have to the United States because we have more oil than we know what to do with here. And I'll get to that at the end of the presentation. So President Trump wanted to make an example of Colombia and threatened tariffs on a country that he knew he had a lot of leverage over. Over that same weekend, Honduras came out and said, we actually don't like these things that the Trump administration is saying. We're going to look towards China maybe for help in the future with our economy. You didn't hear anything in the news about that. It was all about the Colombia trade spat. The flip side of this, though, and the thing that should worry you in this room, is that the Trump administration was willing to make an example out of Colombia by risking you. Because Colombia is one of the biggest corn importers in the entire world, number 4. They also import a lot of soybean meal and even a significant amount of soybeans. So yes, President Trump went away from those tariffs at the last second and claimed victory. The Colombian side also claimed victory as well. But what I want you to see here is that President Trump is cashing checks that sometimes you are going to have to pay, because U.S. agriculture is such an important part of how the United States makes foreign policy. So if you're thinking about what is the most important question to consider for the next 2 years when it comes to geopolitics, it is, does President Trump really mean these things? Is he bluffing? Is this all about making better trade deals in the rest of the world? Or does he really believe that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, and he's going to raise those tariffs no matter what, and no matter how much short-term pain that it causes in general? I said this last week, even as during my presentation he was talking about Canada and Mexico tariffs, and I thought about changing it, but I'm sticking to my guns. I think he's bluffing. I don't think he really believes in all this stuff. I think he wants better trade deals, and there are a couple countries that he's going to go after. I could be wrong about this. And this is one point I really want to emphasize to you over the next 2 years. It doesn't matter how brilliant I am, how great my models, how profound my grasp of history and all these other things. President Trump is a change agent. And unless you know somebody who's having breakfast with this man, you have no idea what's going on in his head. I don't have any idea what's going on in his head. If you read the books from his cabinet officials during the first administration, like H.R. McMaster, they talk about how he would get people in the room who disagreed with each other, and whoever had the last word was usually the person that he went with, and then sometimes a week later, he would just change his mind. Sometimes he would just be reflexively contrarian for the heck of it. And as a contrarian myself, I actually appreciate that. I like to take the opposite view a bunch of times. So we can talk about what the trajectory here is, but I'm going to give you some models and scenarios for how to think about this, understanding that a lot could change based on what's going on. This, by the way, is President Trump. That picture is President Trump and Xi Jinping sharing that beautiful piece of chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago right before Trump decided to announce his big trade war against China in general. Now, why do I think President Trump is bluffing? Well, I think he's got a problem with leverage. The first is with inflation. I love this chart. This chart is showing you what Democrats think is going to happen with inflation over a 5-year time horizon versus Republicans. And you can see that as long as Joe Biden is president, Democrats think inflation is going to be low, and Republicans think inflation is going to be high. And as soon as President Trump took the office, Republicans said, inflation is going to be low, and the Democrats went back to inflation is going to be high. I'm giving you this because I don't think you can trust forecasts and projections and data like this, because it is all politically tinged. I would rather know what's going on with your input prices on the farms and the things that you're facing than with official projections on Bloomberg when it comes to inflation. So I want to paint a picture here of I think prices are probably going to be volatile and are probably going to be up from here. That is a contrarian viewpoint, but I look around the economy, and when I get away from the prognostications, I see things that worry me. This is the yield on the 30-year U.S. Treasury. The higher interest rates go, that means that the market is thinking that inflation is going to be higher and that the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates a little bit. Now, we are nowhere near the stagflation era, 1980s, early 1990s figures, but you can see that we are appreciably above anywhere we've been since the 2008 financial crisis. And crucially, the 30-year Treasury is pointing upwards. It is looking at what is happening in the market and saying, we don't quite buy this. We're thinking that prices might go up from here and that the Fed might have to react. Doubly disturbing for those of you in this room is the status of the US dollar. And this is something that the Trump administration has been talking about a lot. But if I'm right about that inflation call, and if I'm right about some of the other things that are happening in the US economy, the dollar is not going to get weaker at all. The dollar is probably going to continue to appreciate in value. We have this ironic thing happening where we are the flight to safety. We are the flight to security. And it confers upon us a normal political influence and enormous economic influence throughout the world. It also makes our exports less competitive. So even as we are trying to reset some of these trade relationships in the world, it's almost self-defeating because the dollar keeps going up the more that things are volatile in general. Let's go through a couple things in the economy itself. A can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup is up appreciably, and it seems to be pointing upwards as well. Natural gas prices in this country. It might not feel this way, but last year we had the lowest natural gas prices in this country on an annual basis in recorded history. In recorded history. I'm an investor and I'm a betting man. I would bet that we're not going to get the lowest natural gas prices in the year next year. One of the reasons that inflation has come off the boil a bit is simply because when you strip out the energy prices have been historically low. I'm not sure that that's going to continue. Look at shipping. Shipping never really recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic. It came off the boil a little bit, but again, you have things starting to trend up a little bit. And part of that is companies thinking about President Trump's trade wars and importing more stock ahead of time. And there's more demand for trying to get products out there in general. But here's one of the real kickers, because if you go back to every president since Eisenhower, there is only one president who earns the moniker of fiscal conservative, and he's not a Republican. It's Bill Clinton in his second term. Every single US presidential administration, I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican, likes to blow out the deficit. Talks a big game about fiscal conservatism, but as soon as they're in the office, it's goodies for everyone and spending all over the place. And the first Trump administration was particularly guilty of this. You've got an internal battle within the Trump administration right now, where some is about tax cuts and about more fiscal looseness, and others, like Scott Bessent, are saying, no, we really need to rein this in. We really need to be a little bit more disciplined with our spending. I will take the other side of that argument. I bet you that the profligate fiscal guys win just because they've been winning since the early 1950s, and that's also going to drive up prices in general. But here, I think, is the one that bothers me the most, which is the demographics in this country have reached, I won't say unprecedented, but we have the lowest and slowest demographic growth in this country since the 1900s. That includes World War I, and it includes World War II. We are simply not growing from a demographic perspective. At the same time, we have a migration crisis at our border. We are unable to figure out which immigrants we want to bring in legally because we want their skills or want them to become a part of the American story, and which ones we want to keep out and send back to the places that they're going. And you're seeing that with our population growth figures. You're seeing that with wages and how wages and labor supply is getting increasingly tight. That will get all the more so as a result of the deportations and sort of the strategy that the Trump administration is taking towards migration. One of the great superpowers of the United States has always been our ability to take the best and the brightest from other countries in the world and to integrate them into our economy and into our politics. And we have just not been able to do that over the past couple of decades, and it's not something I expect to change anytime soon. That's the 12-month CPI, and again, you can see it's not particularly high, but it's not low, and it's trending in the wrong direction. So one thing, no matter what happens with President Trump, whether he's bluffing or not, he's going to be dealing with higher prices for the American consumer, and that's something that's going to dictate the way that he behaves in his trade wars. The three top destinations for US exports are China, Mexico, Canada. And that's why I'm going to focus on them. If you want to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and other things happening in the world, we can save it for Q&A. But these are the three countries that I'm worried about the most from y'all's perspective. Let's start with China. This is my favorite map in the whole deck. And it's my favorite map in the whole deck because it communicates to you what a fundamentally weak geopolitical power China is. They are surrounded on all sides by US defense treaty allies. South Korea is a US defense treaty ally. Japan is a US defense treaty ally. The Philippines is a US defense treaty ally. Taiwan, I don't think China's going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. I don't lose any sleep about it. I don't think that because they don't have the ships, they don't have the planes, they don't have the Marines, they don't have the capacity to go and get it. It's been their top foreign policy priority to reclaim Taiwan since 1953. It's probably not going to happen anytime soon. The only friend that China has in the rest of East Asia is North Korea. And if you get into a bar fight and North Korea is the only friend that you're expecting to come to your rescue, you're going to lose the bar fight. And that's the situation that China is in right now. China, moreover, in a sort of an ironic twist, is an incredibly unequal country when it comes to wealth. They're supposed to be communist, but they're communist in all but name. The wealth concentration in the coastal areas of China and in their cities has become immense. And if you're wondering what keeps Xi Jinping up at night, it is not Taiwan and some of these other things. It's about how do I redistribute all of that money that is on the coast of China into the Chinese interior without A, setting off a peasant revolution, or B, having these wealthy cadres on the coast come for my head because I'm taking their money. It's a really unpleasant place to be. And it's why I think in the short term, China's probably going to be willing to deal with us. They are probably going to do whatever they possibly can to avert some of the consequences of the trade war that is coming up. I joked just yesterday, where does China need to send its 10,000 troops so that its 10% tariffs get rescinded? Probably no easy place for them to do it. There's a lot of talk about Chinese demographics. I want to throw a little bit of cold water on that. This is a country of 1 billion plus people, hundreds of millions of whom live in the interior and have not joined the wealthy coastal elites in terms of their success. You've got parts of China that are equal to the population of countries like Iran or like Venezuela that are living on $5 a day or probably even less. So this can help you with demographics if you can pull off that redistribution of wealth. One other problem that has been happening for China is that the government has been trying as much as possible to stimulate consumption. It wants the Chinese people to consume more things, and in particular, it wants them to consume Chinese goods. And they just haven't been doing that. They continue to export more and more abroad, and the consumption numbers have actually been pretty low. All of, again, which is going to tell you that China's probably going to be a buyer of US agricultural products in the years ahead. If you look at sort of the last couple of years, it's been pretty good. If you look at this chart and you're a Democrat, you say, well, wait a minute, Jacob. All of this increase in Chinese purchases of US ag goods happens under the Biden administration, and now they're gone. Should we be worried? And if you're a Republican, you look at this chart and say, well, that's only because President Trump gave them the medicine in 2018. Biden's just taking credit for the situation that Mr. Trump created. Maybe, maybe not. That's a conversation we'll have over some bourbons. But you can see that even in the data, China is purchasing more US ag goods in general. And at least on the surface, it looks pretty good. Whether it's soybeans, whether it's corn, sorghum, even beef and chicken, China has been buying more. But here's the part that starts to worry me, and is why I'm going to tell you that China is a viable market for the next couple years, but not going forward. It's not sustainable. One of the first things President Trump did when he came into office was, instead of immediately raising tariffs on China, he said, we're going to do an investigation into whether China met its Phase 1 trade deal requirements of purchases from US agricultural commodities. We don't need to do a study for that. They didn't. They didn't come close. They got 58% of the way there. They bought more corn than they said they were going to, but for everybody else, it wasn't a particularly pretty situation. Not only that, and this is the thing that should really concern us, over the past 10 to 15 years, even if in absolute terms that trade is increasing, our dependence on China as an end market has increased, even as their dependence on us has decreased. So you can see in terms of China's agricultural imports from the United States, that was 27% of the whole pie in 2009. It's down to 18% last year. Whereas for the United States in 2009, they were 13% of our agricultural exports. Now they're up to 19%. If you want to look at soybeans in particular, again, China's soybean imports from the United States that they are sourcing from us have declined from roughly 49% to around 31%. And this is the story where Brazil comes into the conversation, because our share of China's imports has begun to decline. And this is the picture that I think is going to repeat itself, not in the next year or two. I think in the next year or two, China's going to buy because it wants to make President Trump happy so it can deal with its economic problems. But 3 to 5 years from now, as soon as China can source these things from other places, they will. So don't be surprised if that Chinese market is not there when you think it's going to be. Mexico. I've been joking that Mexico has more trade leverage with us than they have since Santa Anna invaded the United States almost 150 years ago. Mexico has a lot of leverage over the United States right now, because if we're going to do the things that we've talked about doing, we really do need Mexico. Now, they had an election themselves last year. Claudia Sheinbaum was elected president. She was elected president with 60% of the vote. Not only that, she has a supermajority in Mexico's Congress, which means she can change the Constitution at will. Her approval rating, and this is from last week, so I don't know how Mexicans are reacting to her skillful negotiations in the trade war, was at 80%. Can you imagine a US president with 80% approval ratings? I don't even think Bush got there after 9/11. Now, what does Claudia Sheinbaum want to change the Mexican Constitution to do? Well, let's take her at her word. This is from Mexico's National Development Plan 2019 to 2023. She wants to achieve self-sufficiency in corn and beans, and then 3 years later in rice and beef and pork and poultry and eggs and milk. She wants that to decline considerably as well. So here is a populist, popular, state-oriented Mexican politician saying, we really don't want to import that much from the United States going forward. Now, it's nice to want things. My 2-year-old wants a pony. It's another thing to actually do it in practice. And over that same time period, actually, Mexico's imports from the United States have gone up. And as you can see on this chart, their food self-sufficiency has gone down in general. One of the interesting things about the US-Mexico-Canada free trade renegotiation under the first Trump administration is actually Mexican imports from the United States increased markedly as a result over that same time period. And again, that goes back into the dollar and some of these other things that I'm talking about. So this is a chart that I'm sure the Trump administration has burned into its mind and wants to bring up to a more even level. But I said, though, that Mexico has leverage. What is that leverage? Well, first, they're dealing with a migration crisis, too. The migration crisis at our border is not like it was in the 1990s when it was primarily Mexicans who were trying to get to our border. The people who are showing up at our border are Venezuelans and Ecuadorians and Hondurans and Guatemalans and Nicaraguans. And they get to Mexico before they get to the United States. So Mexico can meaningfully help us trap some of those migrants or stop that flow of migrants northward if they want to. And this is something the Mexican government has been talking about for some time now. What about fentanyl? The red line is U.S. seizures of fentanyl at the U.S.-Mexico border. That blue line is Mexican seizures of fentanyl at the U.S.-Mexico border, almost through the end of 2023. I don't know if you noticed it, but immediately after President Trump was elected, Mexico suddenly made a record fentanyl bust at the border. And now they're going to dispatch 10,000 Mexican troops to the border as well to stave off that first 25% of tariffs. By the way, is that the Mexican military? Is that the Mexican police? Is it the Mexican National Guard? Are they in the pockets of the cartels? We don't know the answers to any of these questions. But Mexico knows that fentanyl is a problem, and that they can at least signal to us that they're going to do something and have some leverage in general. Everybody had talked about over the last year that Mexico has surpassed China as our biggest trading partner. And this was seen in especially Washington think tank circles as a wonderful and momentous development. Nobody thought to pull the next chart, which is, well, what do Mexican imports from China look like over the same time period? We haven't decreased our dependence on China at all. It just goes into Mexico first and then comes across the border. And that's one of the reasons why the Mexican government for the last 6 weeks has been saying, hey, President Trump, you see all these counterfeit Chinese goods we've been seizing at the border? See all these ways that we're helping to make sure that these Chinese goods don't get north and into the United States market? So Mexico has a lot of leverage here, and we should pay attention to that leverage because they have been announcing all sorts of plans, whether it's with nearshoring, whether it's with manufacturing, whether it's with energy and electricity, billions of dollars worth of money going into making Mexico more self-sufficient, and we should take them at their word. Just for fun, that is a political cartoon from yesterday from one of Mexico's biggest papers after President Trump took off the tariffs. They weren't particularly afraid. They look at the United States and think Trump is literally shooting himself in the foot. So you can agree or disagree. That's what the Mexican narrative is on what's happening in the White House. The situation is not as rosy for Canada, although Canada does have some leverage as well. Their imports have expanded faster than our exports to them have expanded over this time period. But as I mentioned before, their biggest export to the United States is oil. And we really don't need their oil that much. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Trump administration has pushed so hard on Canada in the last couple of weeks. The problem, though, is when you look at, especially in the upper Midwest, supply chains and how much of that is dependent on trade with Canada, you're getting a 40, 50, even 60% of state GDPs in the upper Midwest dependent on that trade with Canada in general. And that's why I think that the whole thing about Canada with President Trump, I think, is more about Justin Trudeau than it is about actual politics and economics. I think he doesn't like Trudeau. I think he thinks Trudeau is this sophisticated guy who has announced himself as the leader of the woke world and looked down on Trump in the first administration. And he saw that Trudeau was really weak and that he could help show him the exit stage right by doing what he did over the last couple of weeks. I think as soon as we get a new Canadian leader, probably Mr. Trump is going to be singing a different tune. And he'll have to sing a different tune because Canadian leaders are not just going to bow down to whatever he wants. You can't keep making the 51st state quip and expect that the Canadians are going to take it lying down. They're not going to. The last sort of thing that I want to go in here, and this will be a real fire hose, is that one of the reasons President Trump doesn't have a whole lot of leverage here is because we don't know how to make things in this country anymore. I've been reading this nerdy book, The Construction of Gothic Cathedrals, lately. It's about how we literally have forgotten how to build the immense and beautiful cathedrals that are in Europe, if you've seen any of them. We literally don't know how the stonemasons did what they did to build these things. Now, we can build planes and computers and all sorts of things that they couldn't do in the medieval era. We have cures to diseases, but we have forgotten how to do this. Ditto this, by the way, for the pyramids. Nobody knows how the Egyptians actually made the pyramids. It is so confounding that there are real people out there who think it's evidence that aliens came to the world and dropped the pyramids in and then left. All of which is to say is that civilizations can forget how to do things. And we have forgotten in this country how to make things. China is the country that makes things in our world. They have over 35% share of gross manufacturing production in the world. Our share is roughly 12%. If you want to say, oh, but we make the really important stuff, right? Okay, fine. Like if you go to value added, is that 16% there versus China's 27%? And when you add in the rest of the world, that's well above 50%. You want just a couple of examples? There's no country in the world today, including us, that can make a semiconductor start to finish. It's a completely globalized supply chain. Taiwan has the factories. Japan and South Korea have all these specialty chemicals that you need. The Dutch, of all people, have a 100% monopoly on the equipment that goes in the factories in Taiwan to make the chips. We do a lot of the software and design. The much vaunted United States Navy, which is supposed to patrol the oceans and safeguard American power and global trade, we don't make ships anymore. Our percentage of global shipbuilding capacity is less than 2%. And it would take a long time to try and fix that. Rare earth metals and materials and other elements that are critical to industrial processes, we don't refine these in the United States anymore. We don't refine them in the United States, not because they're actually rare, but because it's really costly and environmentally destructive. And we thought China should do it, and we should just import them cheaply. I work with a guy who is CEO of a startup that is trying to refine some of these rare earths inside of the United States. I asked him, hey, let's say the Trump administration came to you and said, no cost too high, what would it take for you to actually refine some of these materials in the United States going forward? He said 5 to 10 years minimum, and that's if everything is perfect. We get most of these things from China and Canada. Solar panels, between 74% and 96% come from China. Cell towers, all the little radios and switches that go in cell towers, we make a grand total of 0 of that in the United States. We get it all from Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. So you want 5G, you want all these autonomous networks and smart agriculture and smart drones, better start building those radios and switches in the United States as well. Pharmaceuticals, this is one of the ones that really gets me going. Generic drugs, so your ibuprofens, your Tylenol, some of these generic antibiotics and things like that, we're getting 31% from China. Another 26% from India in general. Fertilizer. Our friends in Canada have the potash market completely on lockdown. Everything else is coming from China, Russia, or Belarus. We don't do this stuff anymore. We get it from the rest of the world. Agriculture and machinery. If I was advising the Trudeau government, I would say stop going after Trump and his stupid jokes and just show him this chart. Show him that over 40% of the agricultural machinery that is coming into this country is ultimately imported from Canada in general. So I ask you again, is he bluffing? I think he's bluffing. I think he knows that he's at a moment where US influence is at its maximum, and he does want to renegotiate some of these deals in ways that help the US market. If he's not bluffing, then inflation is going to get even higher than I'm expecting, and we're going to be in a very difficult world. And it'll be important here to separate signal from noise. I think the fact that he threatened Mexico and Canada and then took it off, that I think is a sign to me that he is bluffing, that we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of the things that he's doing, but should have all of this in mind. Okay, I have 7 minutes left. Corn and soybeans. You guys are unique in the US agricultural complex in the sense of how deeply intertwined you are with energy. In some ways, when I'm prepping to talk to this specific audience, it has to be as much an energy preparation for me as it does an ag preparation and a geopolitical preparation. And that's because roughly half of the corn and soybeans that are grown in this country ultimately find their way into the US energy complex. Now for corn, this is an old story. This starts with ethanol back in the mid-2000s. For soybeans, this is a more recent development that goes around the advent of renewable diesel. And here, in addition to multipolarity and the changing of the guard in agriculture globally, we also need to think about something that is happening in the US energy complex. One of the reasons that President Trump can throw his weight around is that for the first time in almost 100 years, the US is a net energy exporter. Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George Bush, they might have wanted to pursue some of the imperialist foreign policies that President Trump is pursuing, but there was no way that they could. Because the United States, since the 1950s and the 1960s, has imported energy from abroad and was completely dependent on those imports of energy from abroad. And as you can see on this chart, that just began to change in the early 2020s. The shale revolution is a little bit long in the tooth. Really, the technology came out around 2008, 2009, but in terms of actual impact on our energy flows, it's been just the last couple of years. And it confers tremendous power, but also some disadvantages for the US consumer and producer in general. Now look at how we actually consume energy in this country today. It's a combination of petroleum, natural gas, and some renewables there. What I want you to see is that the lion's share of fuel that is going towards transportation is still petroleum. Natural gas is big in industrial and commercial, renewable, even coal and nuclear. They are also going into industrial, residential, and commercial. But you're still talking about 80% of the energy that we use to transport things in this country is still coming from petroleum. Not only that, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon because our electricity market is about to get strained in a major way. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the advent of refrigerators and air conditioning and all of these other power-hungry things that required a lot of electricity consumption and energy consumption. And that's why you saw massive increases in electricity consumption over that time period. For the last 20 or 30 years, electricity consumption growth has been going down. That's one of the amazing things about the digital revolution. We've actually been consuming less and less energy as we do these things. But that's about to change because whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's data centers, whether it's AI, no matter who you talk to, whether it's McKinsey or Princeton University or the US government, we're talking about somewhere between tripling or 10xing our energy consumption over the next 5 to 10 years. Not only that, the grid is not really built for that. These areas in red are places that are going to have power blackouts probably over the next 5 to 10 years as a result of all this. Meanwhile, we are exporting more energy than we ever had before. We used to export almost no LNG abroad. Last year, we were one of the biggest sources of European LNG imports out there. We have literally been keeping the lights and the heat on in Europe during the Russia-Ukraine war as a result of our LNG exports. So our natural gas, in some sense, is already taken for. Last but not least, oil prices. If you want to see where Joe Biden lost the election, it wasn't at the debate. It wasn't when he was falling off stages and things like that. It's when oil hit $5 a barrel and stayed relatively elevated. Well, I should say diesel $5 a barrel and gasoline slightly below that. But if you want to know when he lost the election, it was right there. And if you think President Trump doesn't know this and doesn't know that he absolutely has to keep gasoline prices down if he wants to follow through on some of the things that he's talking about, he knows that that's exactly what he needs to do. All of which is to say you should be rooting for two things. Number one, you want him to drill, baby drill as much as possible, but you also want him to export, baby export as much as possible. Because if you surge production and you don't export it abroad, then fuel prices could collapse in this country. And that will obviously mean bad things for biofuels and renewable diesel. If we're exporting it abroad, though, and the prices of natural gas and oil start increasing for the American consumer, which is what I think is going to happen, suddenly President Trump is going to look at biofuels and renewable diesel and things like that and see a major advantage for him in the context of what he's trying to accomplish. I think that's going to be one of the biggest changes from the first administration to the second administration. We've got a lot more renewable diesel capacity that has come online. Ethanol production has also been going up slightly. And this is where the trade war is also incredibly advantageous in terms of the US energy complex. The EPA last year thought that renewable diesel was primarily going to come from soybean oil, canola oil, and then other fats and greases, and that was mostly going to be domestically sourced. They were shocked last year when that wasn't what happened at all. First of all, the United States was importing renewable diesel from abroad, where we don't know the actual feedstock source, and then we were importing used cooking oil and tallow and canola in order to meet some of these renewable diesel demands. That's US trade of animal fats and vegetable oils. You can see that those imports have increased considerably, which is why if you want to protect the biofuels industry in this country, and that is something I think the Trump administration wants to do, you absolutely want to go at China, and you absolutely want to have a conversation with Canada about these things, because the biofuels renewable diesel conversation has been completely skewed by the existence of really countries that are dumping these things into the US market. This is something I think the Trump administration is absolutely going to attack, and that is something that should give you some hope for these things going forward. If I'm right about that, you're also going to be sitting on a lot of things like soybean meal. This is a market I'm fairly bullish on. Start thinking about the types of livestock that you could raise with all of that cheap soybean meal. If you don't want to do that, maybe we're not the low-cost producer of soybeans themselves in the global marketplace, but we can certainly be for soybean meal if we meet some of these quotas on renewable diesel. And there are countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, that are not even in our top 10 for the most part for where our soybean meal exports go right now. So there's a lot of change out there and a lot of opportunity that we can find in general. I'm getting to the end, and I haven't gotten to the health stuff yet, so I'm going to leave it for Q&A. But if you want to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and what he means, maybe we can save it for the Q&A. But I want to leave you on a positive note. The most common question I get when I'm giving presentations is, Jacob, how do you stay sane? It feels like everything is going to hell in a handbasket, that the world is getting worse, that morality is declining. Well, some scientists published an article in Nature where they got access to US survey data from 1949 to 2019 that was asking Americans the same question. Do you have faith in the future? Do you trust your neighbor? Do you think the young generation is ready to take over? And 84% of the time, Americans said, the world is getting worse, morality is declining, I don't trust my neighbor, and future generations are not that great. They didn't have that kind of data for the entire world, but if you look at this map here, the countries that are in red, they had data from 1996 to 2007 for these countries, which I regard as the apex of human civilization based on the music that came out in the world during this time period. And roughly 80% of the people during that time period said, yes, the world is getting worse, I don't trust my neighbor, my children, I don't recognize the morals that they have, the world is becoming a bad place. And these psychologists attributed this to two things. Number one, our brains like negative news. It's like junk food for our brains, and we're getting it beamed into our brains more than ever before. These social media platforms literally give us the things that are going to give them more clicks, and this is true right up into the news publications as well. Negative things, people click on it more. They stay on it more, and everybody knows that. When you're driving down the highway and there's an accident, you don't want to stop and look at the accident, but you're going to stop and look at the accident. We're all going to stop, and then the traffic jam is going to pile up. The second interesting thing they found, though, was that most people 20, 30 years later forget how bad things were in the moment. They have nostalgia, where it's this constant feedback loop where, oh, do you remember the good old days when everything was good? Today is the day that sucks. Today is the day that morality is declining and things were better before. So I want to leave you with this little thought experiment. This is a picture of Wall Street in 1896. I want you to sit with the picture for a moment. Imagine what it's like to be there. There's no electric light, so you can imagine how dark this street probably is at night. No electric cars, it's horses and buggies, so you can imagine how that smells in New York City in the summer. Pretty conservative clothing, maybe you've got a whiff of starch, things like that. The road is probably not paved, so you can hear the crunching of gravel or sand underneath shoes there. So that's 1896. That's Times Square 15 years later. And this is why I say the last multipolar environment in the world was the 1890s. And it was a time of incredible technological effervescence, of cultural transformation. There were so many different opportunities out there. And I think the exact wrong thing to do in the current international environment is to get in the fetal position and say, things are bad, or the government needs to come save me, or I'm not sure, there's all this uncertainty and volatility. There's always uncertainty and volatility. If I have the privilege of coming back here 15, 20 years from now, I bet we'll be saying things like, do you remember 2025? Do you remember how great our civil discourse was? Do you remember how nice we were to each other? Do you remember how Gen Z was really taking up the baton from future generations? Today is when things are so bad. I asked ChatGPT to imagine what Fargo would look like in 2039. That's what it gave me. I don't know if that's particularly realistic or not, but if you take one thing away from my presentation, whether I'm right or wrong about all the politics, is that these are the years of plenty. These are the years to invest. These are the years to jump on the changes that are happening, because when I look out at the global marketplace, I see change and I see opportunity. If we continue on this trajectory 10, 15 years from now, we could have some big problems, but the people who are going to do the best are the ones that see the change in front of them and are not afraid to go tackle it. Whether it looks like that or the ChatGPT image or not, I'm not sure. But I think now is actually the good time in politics, and don't be caught 10, 20 years from now into looking back and saying, man, times were good then. So with that, I'll be quiet and happy to take questions and answers, and especially disagreements. Thank you.
All right. Well, we do have a few questions that have already come in. I'll read them off here and let you take a crack at them. Again, we have QR codes. If you'd like to submit a question, we've probably got 5-6 minutes here. We can answer some questions. So rapid fire for you.
Let's do it.
Did the U.S. government, when we're talking about Ethiopia exports and wheat, how did that happen? Did they get money? Did U.S. government give them money to help? Did their own country give them money to help? How does that impact U.S. farmers now?
That was the Ethiopian government. They can take a lot of credit for that. They went out into the market, got a lot of good consultants to tell them what they were doing wrong, and then they supported their farmers by going out and fronting the cost for equipment and technology and seeds like that. So no, that was not a U.S. goal. I think U.S. wheat would love to have Ethiopia as an export market in general. So that was an example of a country using resources that were already out there, applying good government policy, policy, and then being able to surge production. And they did that during a civil war. It's a pretty remarkable transformation that they were able to accomplish.
Okay, second question here. Will the BRICS currency and or participating nations be an issue for the U.S.?
Maybe I'm behind the questioner here, but I have not heard of the development of a BRICS currency. You can wake me when the BRICS actually start doing things beyond just issuing press releases and public statements. BRICS itself, I don't put a whole lot of stock in because those nations don't have a lot of interest together and they're not actually doing things together. But as a symbol for how the world is changing, yes, there are going to be other blocks that are going to rise that are going to be really interesting. But I wouldn't focus too much on BRICS. You should focus on how the European Union just had a free trade agreement with South America, with the Mercosur countries in South America. We should be thinking about which country is going to get a true free trade agreement with India. This is something the Trump administration pursued the first time around, is probably going to pursue the second time around. Look at what Turkey is doing in the Middle East, the way that it's sort of building an economy of scale around that. So I don't worry so much about BRICS, but as a symptom of what is happening in the world, yes, it's an important signal.
How likely is it that China's demographic structure collapses in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I don't think that China's demographic structure is going to collapse in the next 10 years. I think there's been a lot of pessimism out there, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about just how resilient and how transformative China is. I sort of tried to say this, but I'll try to say it more pointedly. China has hundreds of millions of people living in the interior who are living on less than $5 a day. They do not need to be having lots more babies or getting lots more immigrants if they can just take those people and bring them up to the lower middle class. That'll give them a demographic boost just as much of any of these other things. Demographics are really difficult to predict. You're literally trying to predict how many babies people are going to want to have 5-10 years from now. I use it as a snapshot for what are the problems today, but not as something that is truly predictive going forward. If I'm wrong about that, it's not a question about China's demographics. It's about China's attempt to redistribute wealth to the interior failing. And if that fails, yes, you might see major problems for the Chinese government, maybe even the loss of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. But everything I see says they're going to muddle through. China's probably never going to be weaker in our lifetimes than they are today, which is why I'm trying to get across to you, sell as much as you can to China and do it for as long as you possibly can, but start preparing the backup plan. 2-3 years from now, anything you send to China, try to think of it as bonus. Don't think of it as the core of what you're doing.
These are great questions. These are great questions. You guys are doing great. Will RFK get confirmed? And what does that mean for agriculture? I think I saw you made it out of committee just a few minutes ago.
You made it out of committee? Well, I'll have to get my magic 8-ball to see if he'll actually get confirmed. What it's going to mean for agriculture, where's my, I can maybe give you a couple slides. We still have it up here. No, I don't have to do that. Look, RFK Jr. Has said a lot of things about seed oils and about health, and he's sort of assembled this coalition of nutritionists and mushroom shamans and everything else who were talking, yeah, there you go, nutritionists, mushroom shamans, and moms who are all together supporting him. And maybe there is a world in which RFK Jr. pushes these things, and I don't want to dismiss the fact that there has been some change in how US consumers are behaving. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Athletic Brewing Company. This is a company that nobody wanted to touch, nobody wanted to invest in a couple of years ago. They're a non-alcoholic beer company. And they figured out that the reason that non-alcoholic beer tastes so bad is because the process of getting the alcohol out strips the alcohol out and it just tastes flat and awful. And so what they decided to do instead was to brew from scratch at the beginning a beer that actually tasted like beer without having the alcohol. And now you've got companies like Dr. Pepper and other falling over themselves, trying to invest millions in this country. They're probably going to have $1 billion valuation, which is to say something is changing with the US consumer. If you're looking at millennials and Gen Z in particular, they are spending at a higher rate on things like health and nutrition than previous generations. So I regard that as a real trend. And if you can market a product or build a product around that particular niche, you might be able to make billions of dollars. At the same time, I don't think RFK Jr. is going to be able to follow through on a lot of these things. As he himself said, his boss loves a Big Mac and loves a Diet Coke and strong-armed him into taking this picture. More than that, one of the investors who taught me on the investing side of the business how to do things once told me, Jacob, rule number 1, never ever short fat people. Never. And I'm not going to do that, and I won't make that mistake. Think about Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola first started, they had literal cocaine in their drinks. They took the cocaine out, they're still around. We're still drinking the Coca-Cola. So I do think there are niche opportunities in the health space, and I think there are cultural changes happening around that. I don't think that RFK Jr. is going to take away a lot of these things and that he threatens to, and that if he tries to, the Trump hammer will come down on him. So a little nuanced answer there. There is some change happening, change that I would encourage you to explore on the edges as entrepreneurs, but don't run for the hills just because RFK Jr. is saying crazy things.
I've got two more quick questions here. Immediate long-term trade agreement outlook. Are we done with trade agreements? Are they going to look different? I keep asking this question. Is it the end of free trade?
It's been the end of free trade since 2010s. So trade globalization has been declining since 2010. This is not something that began with President Trump. I would actually say it began with President Obama. He picked a little fight over chicken and tires with China back in 2014. And that's where I would really pinpoint the beginning of this. The short-term outlook for free trade agreements, or trade agreements in general, is very bad. I think Trump is trying to convince everyone with all of his moves just how scary he can be. But I think he wants deals, and he wants deals selectively with the countries that are going to help the U.S. the most. So I think all this U.S., Mexico, Canada, that's about the USMCA renegotiation that's coming up. I think that'll get done. I think Trump really wants to deal with India. I think he'll push hard on that. I think he might try to push on the European Union, or it's going to be a lot harder for him to do that. So over the longer term, over the 2 to 4 year time horizon, I actually expect you should see some more trade agreements, but it's not going to go back to free trade. It's not going to be everybody join the WTO and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. It's going to be no. We want trade agreements with these countries, and also if you don't do what we say you're going to do, or if you don't buy our particular products, you will get these tariffs or these consequences.
Okay. Last question here. Do you see the focus on ag and energy and carbon capture enduring?
I do see it enduring, and I see it enduring for as long as the U.S. energy complex is obsessed with exporting abroad. If I'm wrong about that, or if the U.S. energy complex is not exporting abroad, and they're just producing more and more, and energy prices here are plummeting, then I'm wrong, and things are going to get a little bit dicey here. But no, I think that that is something that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. I'm really curious to see if one of the things that President Trump pushes Europe on, in particular, for example, is sustainable aviation fuel. I know you're going to talk about SAF a little bit later, but from my geopolitical perch, the place that has the biggest mandates and the biggest demand for SAF is Europe. But they want nothing to do with soybeans and corn as a feedstock. They want it to be synthetic or some of these other things. The only country in the world that has the regulatory demand and the lack of capacity to produce is Japan. And they don't have enough to satisfy all the things that we're talking about in this country. So if you could get Europe, for instance, to say, hey, we'll scratch your back, and in addition, we want you to reserve 15% or 20% of your SAF quota for U.S. feedstocks that are vegetables or that are corn or soybeans in general, that could be really positive. So I'm sorry, I rambled a little bit there. The short answer to that question is yes. I think the relationship between ag and energy is going to be enduring. And when you're thinking about U.S. foreign policy in the next 5 to 10 years, we have to do something that none of us have done in our lifetimes. Treat us like an energy superpower. It's one of our biggest sources of leverage over different countries, and you are already seeing how President Trump is wielding that. And in particular, for corn and soybeans in this room, you are part of that complex. You are part of the leverage that the Trump administration thinks it has when it's going and thumping away at Canada and Colombia.
All right, thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. And you'll be around for a little while if they have questions?
I will be here all day. So.
He's going to be here all day. So if you have more questions, please find him, bring a bourbon, have a conversation.